CBT Nuggets JNCIS Security Series Configuring Remote Access to the SRX. Well, in this nugget, we are going to start out, first of all, looking at our topology, our real topology that we're going to use, and one that I really suggest that you use to prepare for this JNCIS security exam, and not a bad one to use for your branch office configuration either. We'll look at the default configuration on my SRX 210, and then we'll look at configuring remote access to the SRX. That's going to include configuring our system services, looking again at interfaces and zones, and configuring some basic routing. Sound good? All right, let's get to it. Now, as I mentioned, our first order of business is to walk through the default configuration, and we're going to do it on our SRX 210 here. But before I do that, let me give you kind of the first phase of the big picture of what I'm going to accomplish here in my lab. And by the way, this is probably a highly recommended setup for you to use in your own configuration lab to prepare for a deployment to a branch office, a remote office, and to prepare for the exam. Okay, so I've got an SRX 210. And I've got an SRX 100. And by the way, I wouldn't spend any more money than this. I would go out and get a 210 and a 100 on eBay, used easily well under $1,000, and then just resell them if you don't want to keep them. There is absolutely no reason to go out and spend 10 grand on a higher end SRX appliance, especially if you're just trying to prepare for the exam. Okay, so this is a great setup, and this is what I'm going to be using. So as we can see here, I've got 2 gigabit Ethernet ports, okay, gig E000 and gig E001, and then I have 6 fast ports. So what I'm doing is I'm taking gig E000, which by default is already in the untrust zone, and I'm going to go ahead and make this a DHCP client. In other words, I'm going to connect this to a DSL or a cable modem, which is probably very likely in a branch office, remote office, hotel, retail chain, whatever. You've got some inexpensive broadband connection. You'll just connect this to that particular device. Switch, router, modem. It's kind of all those things in one. And then gig E01, this will be in the trust zone, and this is going to go to my corporate LAN. Okay, so I'm going to connect this to a switch. As a matter of fact, just like this one, a 2200 series switch. And of course, I can connect all my devices on my laptops, my PCs, my departmental servers, my printers. I can hook those up into this switch, this 24 port switch, or you could have a higher end, higher port density switch, and those would be connecting on the trust zone on this particular port. We could also talk about remote access from, let's say, one of the laptops here in the corporate LAN, or maybe even remote access over the untrusted network. Okay. For right now, we need to have this base set up. Okay, so we'll come back to this diagram. We'll review it over and over, and let's go ahead and go into the SRX 210 and walk through the default configuration, which you really need to understand before you do anything else. Well, I'm on my SRX 210. As you can tell, it's not totally pristine. I have changed the host name to SRX 210, but I have reverted it back to the default factory configuration. There's several ways to do that. You can do a command, or there's a little button on the front of the 210 where you just get like a paper clip or something, and you push it in for over 15 seconds, and it'll revert back to the default factory config, which is what I did. Okay, but I've still retained the host name that I configured from having this device configured previously. So that being said, let's do a show config and take a look at the stanza, we can call it, or our hierarchical configuration. Now the first thing we see under the system stanza is auto installation, and you would only see this if you are basically truly looking at a default factory config for the first time. So what this auto installation does, and you can kind of see the commands here, is it sets up this SRX to get an IP address on the first Ethernet port, which is gig E000. You can see the boot P service there. So you could connect it to, let's say, an upstream switch / router / cable modem / DSL modem, for example. It also sets up some name servers, 208.67.222.222 and 220. These are actually public ones at opendns.com. That way we can go ahead and resolve some DNS names. We're still under services here, and you can see some of the services that we're going to enable by default: secure shell, telnet, web management, and it's doing this HTTP, HTTPS on VLAN 0. Okay, so this is our default VLAN. As a matter of fact, all of our other fast interfaces, the fast Ethernets, are in this default VLAN 0. Now this is not the native VLAN, okay, because the SRX, well, Juno switches do not have a native VLAN, okay, like Cisco does. But this is the default VLAN 0, or the only VLAN that exists at this point in time. We can also see that the system generates an RSA certificate in order to support HTTPS. And this is very important down here. We're going to set up a DHCP server, and it's going to hand out IP addresses along this range: 192.168.1.2 all the way to 254. And it's going to inherit the settings, or propagate settings. It's going to inherit them from GigE000 unit 0. So GigE000 is the physical interface, and then .0 is the logical interface. And really the logical interface is what we have a lot of our properties assigned to. Remember, GigE000 is configured to get an IP address automatically from an upstream device. This is the default gateway, by the way, that's going to be given out to these DHCP clients: 192.168.1.1. Okay, let's go look at some of the syslog information here. Syslog is going to create logs that are 100 kilobytes in size. We're also going to send emergency level messages to all of our logged in users. We're also going to log the less critical messages to a messages file we can see right here. Interactive errors are logged to a file called interactive commands. Okay, max configurations on flash and rollbacks means we're going to save 5 previous rollback images. Auto update here, this says we're going to get our keys, our license keys, from this Juniper URL. We also see a warning that says, hey, there's a missing mandatory statement, root authentication. So we're going to have to configure root authentication, which I had done previously, but like I said, I reset this for the default config. So we'll go ahead and do that. Remember, we cannot save any changes to our configuration until we set up that root authentication. Okay, here's our interfaces. Notice that we've got an interface range here called interfaces trust. This is actually an interface range of GigE001 through Fast Ethernet 007. Notice that GigE000 is not in this range. Also, all of these interfaces have some values applied to their unit 0, or 1.0, 2.0, and so on. They're all in the family Ethernet switching, and they're all members of a VLAN known as VLAN trust. Now, this brings up a really interesting conversation, so I'm going to kind of go deep here. You have to realize that if for some reason you wanted to make, let's say, Fast Ethernet 007 as an untrust interface, you wanted to connect that interface up to the service provider or your upstream router or whatever, there's some hoops to jump through, and this is undocumented, really. And why do I mention this? Well, because a lot of the configuration examples that you get from Juniper, some of the examples you see in books that are out there, a lot of them take one of these fast Ethernet interfaces and they make this a member of the untrust zone and have this interface connect to, let's say, your upstream cable or DSL modem or some other router. The problem is, and this is a problem, is that by default, this fast interface is already a family member of Ethernet switching. Well, it needs to be a member of the family INET, okay? Or it needs to be an IPv4, a routing interface. And if you just went in and simply said, let's delete the family Ethernet switching and tried to configure it and set it as family INET, it wouldn't let you. Okay, it would bark at you and give you an error message. Why? Because it's still a member of this VLAN. Okay, it's still technically a switched interface in a VLAN, member of VLAN trust. So you actually have to go through and jump through some hoops to remove it from this interface range. Okay, interface range of interfaces trust. So, long story short, best case scenario, and this is hard to do sometimes if you're trying to go through this on your own equipment, and you are trying to use example configs from Juniper, for example. A lot of them will take one of these fast Ethernet interfaces and they'll place it in the untrust zone, but they don't tell you all the underlying hoops you have to jump through. So I'm going to recommend to you that you go ahead and stick with gig E000 as the member of the untrust zone. Okay, and leave this kind of as default. Leave these as members of the VLAN trust. All right. So gig E000 is really by default out of the box kind of our WAN port. It's the routed port, and by default it gets an IP address from a DHCP server, but you could statically configure that GigE interface with a static IP address and mask and its own default gateway. I'll show you how to do that. We'll do it actually in commit confirmed mode so we can just roll back automatically. We won't apply the configuration, but I'll show you the settings to do that. We're going to go ahead and have, as I showed you in my diagram, this is going to go ahead and still be a DHCP client port. Okay, here we can also see the settings for that VLAN 0, the default. Okay, there's some security features down here. We'll talk about NAT later on, but by default, from the trust zone to the untrust zone, we're doing what's called source NAT. We'll talk about that later on. We've also got some default screen settings, not scream. You may want to scream as you look at this configuration, but it's just the screen. These are what we call our denial of service countermeasures. So some basic defaults for protecting the control plane of this SRX. Okay. We'll talk more about that as well. Also, here's our zones, and we can see we've got the trust zone, we've got the untrust zone. In the trust zone, basically the host inbound traffic setting is all system services, all protocols. Okay, and then of course on interfaces VLAN 0, which is all those interfaces are in VLAN 0, they're in the trust zone. So that's an easy way to apply this. In the untrust, okay, we can see we've got a screen set up, and that goes back up to these settings here because this is the interface by default that's in the untrust zone, the one that connects to ultimately our service provider. Okay, and we can see we've got some other system services there, DHCP and TFTP. Here's a default policy. So this is, you have a from zone trust and a to zone untrust, and basically it's just any source address, any destination address, any application permit it. So what this basically says is any traffic from the trust zone to the untrust zone is going to be allowed. Okay, and that includes the traffic that's coming back from those sessions that initiate on that trust zone interface. Well, that's our default configuration. So let's go ahead now and go in and start configuring our base settings for our SRX 210 so that we can start getting to the real goal of this particular nugget, and that is setting up remote access. But of course we have to have this default setting before we can start looking into remote access and administration. Okay, before I go too far, I'm going to exit out of here, and I'm going to log back in as a power user and practice what I preach. And we'll clear the screen and we'll operate as M. Shannon power user. Okay. Now remember, our long-term goal here is to connect to a cable / DSL / satellite box that's going to be basically switching and really a router and a modem, okay, for whatever broadband connectivity that I have to my service provider. In my case, it'll be a cable modem / router. But let's say hypothetically that I want to connect to an upstream router. And instead of having a DHCP address assigned to this interface here, let me make a little box. Maybe I don't want to have a DHCP address assigned to this interface. Maybe I want to go ahead and statically assign it with an address that is on a subnetwork that connects to an upstream router here, let's say like a Juniper 2320 or a 2350, right? Which will have its own modules in it, and those modules will connect up to the service provider. A very common scenario once you get beyond kind of the small branch office. So let me show you that configuration because we need to know it, okay? Now, I don't want to save this configuration, so I'm going to go ahead and get into configuration mode, and I'm going to do a commit confirmed, and I'm going to do it for, let's say, I'll say 15 minutes. Shouldn't take anywhere near that long, but that way it's not going to save my configuration. It'll automatically roll it back. And this is a great way to play around, okay? So the first thing I want to do is set that gig E000 interface logical unit 0 properties. Now, gig E000 is already in the untrust interface, but let me show you the command anyway to put it in that state. Okay, so set security zones, security zone, and then untrust interface, in my case, gig E000. Now, let me just tell you this right off the bat. If I'm trying to do this, and I mentioned this earlier, if I'm trying to do this to one of those fast Ethernet interfaces like FE007 that's already in that trusted VLAN, it's not going to let me go through with this, okay? But this is already in the untrust, and it's not a switch port by default. So then we would set the interfaces, and here I can put in .0, okay, which is the same thing as saying unit 0, which looks like a logical interface, doesn't it? A sub-interface from Cisco. Or I can say unit 0. Family, and lots of options here for family, okay? This is what those other ports are by default. Gig E001, and all the fast ports are Ethernet switching. This is going to be INET 4, but it could be INET 6, okay, if I wanted to. Now, if I wanted it to be an INET version 4 and an INET version 6 on this interface, I would have to have more than one unit. So unit 0 could be IPv4, and then the unit 1 could be INET 6, okay, or IPv6. You can also see, MPLS as well. Maybe you're going to do ISO if you're in that kind of environment. But I'm definitely going to do family INET, okay? And then I'm going to assign an IP address. This is going to be a static address. So we'll say it's 66.129.250.1, and then you use CIDR representation here, so /24. You could also do something like a /30, right? Which means you've only got two valid IP addresses, .1 and .2. So I could do 250.1/30, and then we're assuming that it's connecting to a router port that has the address 250.2/30, which wouldn't be a bad way to go either. So I'm going to do 24. And now I need to, what you normally would do is this. You would set a default route up to that next hop, which in my case is 250.254. So for everything behind this SRX, the default route gets me to that upstream router, okay, which is the J series that gets me to my service provider. Right on? So we need to set the routing options, not routing, okay? This is the south, but we're not going to go that crazy. And it's a static route, and we could put 0.0.0.0/0. I could do that, or I could just make it easier and go 0/0. It's the same thing. And then next dash hop is, and this is a gotcha, okay, when you're setting this up. I'm going to put in the IP address of the next hop, which is 129.66.129.250. In my case, 254. You might think that you need to go ahead and put a /24 here. So if you were doing this in the real world, which this has happened to me, so I'm passing on my wisdom to you. If I did /24, not going to let me do it. So I'll just show you. Okay, invalid input. But it doesn't really give you any intuitive way to know what the valid input is, because it gives you this symbol here at the 6, right at the beginning of the address. So that doesn't really help. So you might think, well, okay, I've got to put /32. Maybe that's it. No, I'm still getting a problem. Okay, I'm still getting invalid input. Here's the issue. When you're doing this, you just put the address. Okay, 66.129.250.254, nothing else. No CIDR representation at all, and it will take it. Okay, now at this point, I've got a static connectivity to my upstream router, and this is the scenario you would do if you're in that environment. Now, I'm not in that environment. I'm trying to replicate a small office, branch office, remote office environment. where you've got a broadband connection to your service provider, which is extremely common. Okay, you're rolling these things out into a bunch of hotel chains or a bunch of auto parts stores or a bunch of insurance offices. You get the idea, right? So that's the idea I want to go with. So I'm going to go ahead and I can exit out of here, by the way, now if I want to. And it asks me, do you want to exit with uncommitted changes? Yes, I do, which is the default. And it's still going to roll back that configuration. Okay, so we'll wait. I'll go get a cup of coffee, and after 9 minutes, we'll come back and we'll look at the configuration of this, making that gig E000 interface a DHCP client. Okay, so I've plugged in my a cable into my gig E000 port, which uplinks to my router/modem. Let's just see if there is any client configuration, DHCP client config on this device yet. There shouldn't be. Okay, nothing there. All right, let's get into configuration mode. And I want to set interfaces, and it's gig E000 family iNet. And instead of putting in address, which is an option, right? We can take a look at that. Address, I'm going to go ahead and put in here DHCP, which is right here, DHCP client. So let's do that. Now, we want to set the security zone or zones, security zone untrust, and its interface gig E000. Then we want to do the host inbound traffic command. So we're doing this on the local interface, followed by the system services, and then DHCP. And then we want to do a commit. We'll do a commit and quit. Okay, commit complete. Something else I like to do after I've done a configuration like that is to do a commit and then check. It will actually check your configuration to make sure that everything's, up to speed, up to par. If there's a problem with your candidate, it will give you some type of feedback, some error message. Let's do a run show system services DHCP. Hey, there we go. So what we can see now is gigabit 000.0 unit 0 with a MAC address of that has obtained an IP address of 192.168.0.16 dynamically assigned from, and here's the lease, okay, and we got some DHCP options. For example, it's got a 24-bit mask. Here's the router, the default gateway 192.168.0.1. And we can also see our name servers are actually different public name servers than I got before, okay? These are 208.180.42.68 and 42.100. Remember earlier in the default configuration, my DNS servers were from opendns.com, 208.67.222.222 and .220. So you can see I've got new public DNS servers now. So I've got that particular interface configured, and I could even ping my gateway. One thing about ping on the Juniper Junos is it's just going to keep on going in perpetuity. Okay, you have to. It's not like Microsoft, which gives you, I think, 4 of them, and Cisco, which gives you 5 of them. It's just going to keep on going. So I'll do a Control C to stop that. I might even want to see if I can ping one of those DNS servers. I can also ping, by the way, let's take a look at our options here, with a count. So let's ping with a count of 5, and we'll do that DNS server. And there we go. So I'm pinging my DNS server. So that's a good thing. Okay, so we're getting closer right now, but we've still got some other stuff to do to get ready for remote access. All right. Okay, so now I want to go ahead and get remote access from a management workstation in my corporate LAN to this SRX. So basically, I will either through the distribution IDF, like connecting in a cubicle, maybe I have this workstation in a small server room or data center, I will connect this workstation to a switch, and then this switch will be in the same VLAN as this particular port right here. In my case, it's going to be VLAN 0, the default VLAN on this switch. So the easiest way to do this, and this is what I would suggest early on, okay? is to just go ahead and connect this either to the gigabit 01 port or one of these fast ports, because the DHCP server will go ahead and assign you an IP address from the 192.168.1.0/24 range. Okay, so that would be, you can see that right here. That's our network that we're dealing with. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm actually going to uplink this switch to gigabit 001. So this single gigabit port is supporting all of the users that are connecting into this switch. Sounds like a good plan. So let's say this is my management workstation here. We'll take a look at my network properties and see that all I did, well, let's take a look at my network properties real quick. Yes, this is Windows XP. Okay. Why am I using XP? Well, I loathe Windows Vista entirely. But I use a lot of forensics tools and other esoteric types of penetration testing tools for security, and they really run best on XP Service Pack 3. So that's what I'm using on this machine. Anyway, you can see that I've got a Juniper admin Ethernet connection that goes to that switch. So if I take a look at this, of course, I just went up here and made sure that it is getting the IP address automatically. And I connected this to the switch, drag this in, and we can see that if I do an IP config /all, here is the Juniper admin adapter, and it received this address 192.168.1.2 via DHCP from the SRX. Okay, so my default gateway is the SRX 192.168.1.1, and it's my DHCP server, and of course here is the DNS information. So easy peasy. Okay, so now what I can do is, since I've configured my services accordingly, and let's take a look at those services real quick. We'll drag this in and do a show config. Secure shell, telnet, web management via HTTP or HTTPS. And again, that interface gig 001 is part of VLAN 0. So those services are going to be available. And again, this is not subject to any policy because it's not interzone, right? And we can see that interface that I'm connected to right there as well. And here we can see security zone trust, the host inbound traffic, all system services, all protocols on those interfaces. So let's go ahead and get rid of that and get rid of that and bring up Ponderosa. Not Ponderosa. Okay, if you ever watched remember that TV show from the 60s, Bonanza, with Hoss and Pa and Little Joe? Okay, this is not the Ponderosa. This is Poderosa. I like to use this. Okay, so we're going to go do a new telnet session first. And we'll do telnet first. And it is, of course, we're going to use that address of the SRX 1.1. Click on OK. Now, when it asks it to log in, it's not going to let me as a root user. If I try to do that, even if I put in the correct password, it's not going to let me. Well, let me make sure oops, that was the password. Hold on. Root. Okay, so that's the error I get. Trying to log in as root user, not going to work. So I need to have at least another user set up, which I do. I have M. Shannon, and I can put in that password, and I get access to the device, okay, through Telnet. Now, in the next nugget, we're going to talk about setting up different role-based access control levels of access to the SRX. So once we get through that nugget, you'll be able to go and create, different sets of users on your device and get different levels of interactive access. Okay, so that's Telnet. We'll exit out of there. I can also do secure shell, and so we'll do a new secure shell. I'm going to do version 2, which is really recommended, and they both use the same port number, but secure shell is actually going to be a more secure option. Okay, and I can even go ahead and put in here my account number and say I want to authenticate via password and pre-populate that. with my information and click on OK. And now, the first time you do this, by the way, it would have asked you to accept the certificate. So my machine is generating an RSA asymmetric key pair, okay, an RSA certificate, and so is the SRX. So there was an exchange that went on there, okay, before this happened. But usually you would get that certificate message. You have to accept the certificate of the SRX, and then you would have to log in with an existing account. So this is the preferred method, of course, secure shell. Obviously, if I'm connected to a switch right there in the server room or the data center, and I have really good physical security, I'm not too worried about it, okay? However, if it's across the entire switch matrix of my company, if I'm located on the other side of the building and I'm accessing a device remotely, I definitely want to use secure shell, the most secure option. Okay, let's go into a web browser and try JWeb for remote management. Let's do HTTPS and see how that goes. 192.168.1.1. Okay, it's untrusted. That's fine. I'm going to go ahead and I understand the risk because it needs to go ahead and get that certificate. We'll add an exception, get the certificate. Okay, so here I see my SRX 210, username M. Shannon. Let's just check it out. Can we log in as root? Okay, so we can log in as root if we are using HTTPS or secure shell. So Telnet cannot log in as the root user. Okay, so it's taking a little bit of time to kind of discover this device and pull up all the information. Okay, so we can zoom in and look at our device here. There's our SRX 210. You can see these two interfaces are up and going. We know this is our outside interface. We can click on that, right click, and we can configure the port. We can monitor the port. We also can go back to the dashboard again. We can see a system ID information over here. We can see some resource utilization going on, some sessions, firewall VPN policies, just the default policy is going on right now, and IPsec VPNs, which we'll be doing later on. So we have a dashboard area, we have a configure area with all these areas we can configure: authentication, NAT, security, IPsec VPN, wireless LAN, switching, routing, class of service, otherwise known as quality of service, system properties. We've also got our services area, and it's a little bit slow populating this information, but under services we see DHCP client, so it's a little clunky. Okay, monitor area, where you can monitor all these different areas. Maintenance, this is where you would go to upgrade this SRX Junos operating system, which, by the way, I'm probably going to do before the end of this nugget. We can look at the licensing information, we can do a reboot here, take a snapshot, and troubleshoot. I'm not going to spend much time here. We're not going to be configuring this SRX in the JWeb. It's actually not something that you'll have to worry about on the exam. I would recommend that you familiarize yourself with it. You may get a question or two just about, what's in the different areas, what's in the different dashboard area, the configure area, monitor and maintain. For example, under maintain, this is where you go to do configuration management, or you can upload your software package and install it, or downgrade. So for example, I could get my operating system upgrade, I could copy it over to this machine, and then I could just browse and I could find that, and I could just upgrade, upload and install my package from right here. So keep that in mind. Okay, when you're done, you can just log out. Okay, and of course I could also log in as M. Shannon, which, as I said, would be the better scenario. Okay, logging in as a power user as opposed to logging in as the root user. Okay, and it shows you up here, you're logged in as, for example. Now, at this point, I pretty much have kind of a base configuration and base access. So I've got a pretty good baseline from this point on. So I might want to go ahead and save my configuration as a rescue configuration, so I can roll back to this point if necessary, no matter what I do to my system. So for example, let's go to configuration mode and we'll do a rollback question mark. And we can see I have a rescue configuration I can roll back to. I created this very recently. Okay, so what you might want to do is run request. See if I can do that here. Yeah, run a request for the system configuration rescue and then save. Okay, so this is the memorize this command. Okay, so at this point, when you get to a good solid, which I have a pretty good solid configuration, right? I've got my gigabit 000.0, which has outside access. I've also got my inside management station, which is getting an IP address dynamically assigned to it, and it's configured. It can access the device and manage it. So I got a pretty good base configuration. So at this point, I would just hit enter, and I would save a rescue configuration. And by the way, then it would show up, and I could just go roll back rescue to get back to this base configuration, no matter how much I mess up my configuration moving forward. That's always a good thing. Now, something else I want to show you before we leave is notice that my internet, I have another interface on this particular workstation that typically goes to the internet on a different IP address. But this is disabled. So really the only enabled interface I have, other than this VMware network adapter, which I'm not using either, is this Juniper. So this machine is going through my switch, my 2200 switch, into my SRX, and then out to the internet. So to show you that I can do that, because I'm in the trust zone going to the untrust zone, let's bring up a browser again. Bring that over. Now earlier I used my browser to access the SRX, but now let's cbtnuggets.com. And there we go. So I'm going through my switch, through my SRX, out to CBT Nuggets. And I can go to certifications. We've got anything going on here kind of exciting. Ooh, Juniper. Hey. JNCIA. All right, there we go. So there I am. And so we're actually accessing the internet. All right. In the next nugget, we'll be looking at configuring administrators. We'll look at users and classes, local administrators, and we'll talk about the possibility of radius support with a couple of options. I hope this CBT nugget was informative for you. I want to thank you for viewing.